You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. Today I'm chatting to Gemma Fulbrook-Felstead, Operations Director at Collaborative Conveyancing, and the topic of conversation today is having that empathy for the profession when it comes to the implementation of technology. I guess the pressure that perhaps companies feel to adopt technology, especially in this day and age in 2024. So looking forward to an interesting discussion, Gemma. I know that, for example, you're not a lawyer. You bring a very different kind of approach to the conversation. So thank you very much indeed for joining the podcast.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me as well.
Not unknown to a podcast yourself either. You run your own podcast, albeit not in legal.
Not in legal, very far away from legal, actually. My own cycling podcast. So very different, actually, to today, David. So we'll see how this goes.
Well, it's lovely to have you on. I wonder in the first instance, please, if you wouldn't mind telling us a bit about yourself and your experience and your role at Collaborative Conveyancing as well, please.
Sure. So I've been with Collaborative for a couple of years now, but prior to that, I was sitting in a kind of PA ops chief of staff role for a management consultancy. Same sort of role, but across completely different businesses. So we worked with lots of professions, lots of businesses across the UK, throughout the world, actually, from law firms to banks to hotels. So my experience is varied. But when I sat and started with Collaborative, I had a lot to learn, if I'm honest. I'd touched on working with law firms before, not conveyancers specifically, and I had worked with technology. I have an interest in that. I'm definitely not as good as the guys. I have a lot to learn every day. It was different, but I liked that I could bring kind of my ops experience into it and run the team and hopefully make the business run as smoothly as possible.
I said that today's discussion was about having some empathy, perhaps with that pressure that conveyancers feel, and just looking quite realistically at the operational side of what they do. You know, we need to move away from paper. We don't have to go paperless. We just have to move away from paper. Do you sort of feel as though conveyancers get the recognition that they perhaps deserve for some of the innovation that's happening in and around this space?
They probably don't, actually. We spoke just before we hit record, actually, David, didn't we? That as someone who's bought and sold houses before, I've used conveyancers. I fully admit I used a variety of, and I didn't know what they did. I didn't really know. I didn't know what they were using to do their role, what experience they had, how they were helping me. That was probably very important, and what could have changed for them over the last, from the time I bought my first house to the time I bought my most recent house. How is that very different? It was interesting, actually. I thought that I think 94% of conveyancers felt really confident that what they did really helped their clients. That's a large figure, isn't it? It's really nice to know, and yet we know, and we've spoken about, and we hear probably daily, that they are all under considerable pressure. And that feels very, very opposite ends of the spectrum to me.
Yeah, you're quoting the Conveyancing Foundation Wellbeing at Work survey there. Similar sentiment is shared in the statistic that says that workplace stress remains a significant factor for 68% of conveyancers, and 14% say that stress is a constant factor in their working lives. Stress is a good thing to a point, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I had a look and I thought, when you choose to go into the conveyancing profession, what draws you into it? I don't know, and I'm sure everybody is different. But what are the sort of things you'll be expected to do? One of them is be very detailed. You've got to be on it, and it's got to be right. You've got to manage your time really well, and that comes with a little bit of workload pressure, time management. Are you expected to be the very best at customer relations? That's also going to add to your pressure, isn't it? And are you expected to be the very best at conflict resolution, because that probably comes up quite a lot, doesn't it? That's a huge part of the job. Do you know that when you join, is that kind of what you signed up for? And I know I've spoken to conveyancers. We have a couple working for us in the business actually, and I can see, although they're not conveyancing as such in that way anymore, I can see how much they love it when they are doing the conveyancing role. They really, really enjoy it, and they are fantastic at it. And I'd love for more people to be able to see that, or for that to be maybe more obvious in the transaction.
I did a podcast yesterday where this very topic came up, and it was about the difference between technical expertise and skills. And being really, really clear, particularly with employees, and perhaps this is some of your management experience coming to the fore, but being really clear with employees about the expectations of the business on the technical expertise, and then perhaps putting things in place that might support them around the skills side of things.
I think they may do, and this is probably in some ways no different to starting out in any other profession. You've done some training and you are experienced and you have great technical expertise and you've come into it for a reason. Have you been supported, or are you supported when you come into the role on some of those, we might call them soft skills? I know that sounds a bit light, but on some of the things we just talked about, which is, how to deal with your clients who come from different backgrounds. It's fairly high stress for them. They're moving house. Have you been taught, or do you have the skills to manage all of the different stakeholders in a transaction? You've got estate agents, you've got brokers, you've got your clients, and you're still trying to do your role as a conveyancer as well. In the fantastic ideal world, you are really supported with that, and I'd love to hear if people were. I think would that help? Would they feel a little bit more valued? Would they feel that they could do their job or help clients as best as they really could?
Drawing on your experience, particularly on the management consultancy stuff, I grapple with this issue about giving people individuality and enabling them to go and do their own thing, and or placing them in processes.
Yeah.
And I see this play out in conveyancing, in that if you're skilled, you've got good soft skills, you're also very technically competent as well, you could be constrained by just being process driven and process orientated. The conveyancing profession has been criticized for being process driven, hasn't it? How do we give people that opportunity to display their flair in a scenario like that?
I'm sure conveyancers individually have their own processes, and that's what helps them, do their day-to-day work. There is potential for them having a little bit of pressure from firm-wide, business-wide, that they also have a need to put processes in. And there's some potential conflict between the two, because many of the individual processes are working really well, and then they have an organisation-wide process that they need to try and adhere to as well. How can we try and make that work, or let them have their own take on it? I guess the very best at their roles are doing their own thing, aren't they? They're using their own skills, know-how, experience potentially as well to do the very best for their client, and then fitting that into a process that works for them, their team, the business. I think it's got to be probably communication between the two, both knowing the reasons why this is important. So I'm a conveyancer, I have my process, I do things, but it's very important for me to also have autonomy in my role, because this is really going to help my client get the best out of the transaction. As a firm, as a business, we need these processes because, and explaining and trying to just maybe have a bit of communication between the two and understanding.
I suspect that cost comes into it as well in a big way. We know that conveyancing fees are too low, and that process is there because somewhere along the line it's been identified as the most cost-effective way to go and deliver that service.
The cost element is probably driven top down. It's probably not decided by the conveyancer, it's probably decided by the organisation or the law firm, the business. Could we communicate all the way through the business, again, why we're trying to do this, how could this improve? Are we trying to make a difference on costs to improve some other things for employees? I don't know. That would be my dream world, wouldn't it? That we're doing that to try and make employees' lives better, or are we doing it for another reason? And do we all know what that is? Just saying we're driving down costs is very difficult to take, a difficult message, I think, for both parties, if that is the message that's being driven down. If we were more transparent about why and how could we improve things, would that help?
I just asked the questions, Gemma. It's easy for me on this side of the table. What about process itself, though? I mean, is process a good thing or a bad thing? You are obviously heavily involved in a business that is trying to create a process where there currently isn't one in particular. So in pre-contract inquiries is a massive challenge for conveyancers at the moment. And it's largely because a lot of conveyancers are working from Word documents that have got huge numbers of different notes or numbers on to delineate where responses have been made or it's been tracked in some way. Is process a good thing?
Yeah, I think it. I mean, I love a process, David. I love it. Yeah, definitely. Otherwise, I wouldn't be an ops otherwise. So yes, I love it. But I have to try and recognise that there are differing levels of processes and people's commitment to them, and ways of doing things so different, aren't they? They're trying all the time as a conveyancer, trying to mitigate that risk and not make mistakes and make sure that everything is accounted for. I think that is an important part of process. Can we ensure that we can do as much as possible to make sure that everything is covered as a conveyancer individually? And then as a firm wide as well, what are we doing to make sure we are keeping an eye on everything kind of top down to make our clients as happy and as supported as they can? I think again there may be a number of processes that may need to be put in place that kind of fit the firm's needs and the conveyancer's needs as well. And unfortunately, this isn't always the best message, but there is an element of transition and change, and that's sometimes tricky for everybody, for firms and for conveyancers. And I know that comes up a lot as well. I think that people do really want to change, but they have to be on board with it and know the reasons why it's going to help them. Because I've already admitted to this. I'm not a conveyancer. I don't have those pressures day to day, but I see them. I speak to conveyancers who have them, and there's got to be a little bit of movement in that. If they're so busy day to day, how will they have time to make a small change to the process to then maybe make a bigger change in the future? And that's got to be, accounted for and discussed, I think.
I'm sensing from what you said there that there's a trade-off somewhere between process and something else. Is that sort of what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I guess they can be. I'm not sure you can go from one to another. So say I'm a law firm and I'd like to implement a new process because I think it's going to be good for everybody, hopefully employees, clients, the firm as well. But I can't do that overnight. So somewhere in the middle, there is this transition period of which is going to be disruptive and feel very different. It's going to feel different for everybody. I think it would be great if we knew it was going to feel different up front, if we knew what that might feel like for us, how that might change our role, and could we maybe adjust our expectations during that time of, I know that workload is very, very difficult to do that, but in order for us to change what we're doing, these things will also have to change for us, or may be different over the coming months. But we could see that if we could implement this or change this process, would it have a better outcome longer term? Because we've got to be in it for the long term, really. That's, I'd love that a conveyancer came into the profession and they wanted to stay in it long term. And I think that is a challenge at the moment as well. A widely documented challenge, and they want to stay in it. So therefore, we all have to think ahead a little bit in that, have we got something that's really fit for future here for everybody?
The age-old question is always, how do we create that buy-in? How do you convince people that change is okay, that it's good, that even if it's incremental change. And I'm a big fan of Kaizen and those 1% gains add up to a much bigger overall picture. How do we convince people of that, of adopting technology for the sake of argument?
I think it's probably a good idea up front to get everybody's fears and concerns out in the open, because there will be some. Fears might be a little bit strong, but concerns over what could change, what's going to change, it's going to feel very different. What are we concerned about? And I'm sure there are concerns higher up that are around, oh, if we change this thing and it doesn't work, that's a big risk for us as well. And conveyancers have their own fears about that. Will I be able to manage my workload if I make this change? Will everything be as secure as I've got it to be now? Will I be able to track exactly what I'm doing in the great way that I've spent many years developing and doing now? Could we talk about those and get them out in the open first, so everyone is really clear what are we worried about before we put this change in? And potentially what could we do to try and mitigate that? And that's going to be very different, isn't it, for each firm, for each conveyancer, but just to have that open discussion up front. I think anywhere where there is a style of just this is what we're doing, there's always got to be a why behind it as well, and people have to really understand the why and be able to challenge it.
Well, go on, let's dive into that a touch further then. How do we encourage people to challenge it? Because there's loads and loads of occasions where you might wander into a meeting, there's a diktat of some description from above, and you sit very quietly, take it all in, wander out and go, well, that's a really bad idea. I'm not going to go away and do that. How do we create that right forum so that people can respond appropriately?
It's difficult, isn't it? I could say, oh, we can all sit round a table and we can all talk really openly. Like, and then we have the reality, don't we? People think differently. Some are, we have this in our business actually. Some people are very reflective and they like some time to think about it, and others will openly, straight away, just give feedback. And there's going to be a whole spectrum of people in between. So we have to provide an environment where maybe there is a point where we have to listen and say, okay, we're taking that in. And some people may talk straight away and get their comments heard straight away. And then maybe we need to come back to it in days, weeks, whatever it may be, and ask for opinions again and give people different ways to communicate those back. Some people might like to talk in a group about it. Others may like a one-on-one, or to write something down, or to say, actually, could you explain that bit to me again? I'd really like to talk about that. And again, that all does sound very lovely, doesn't it? We're going to do it, but we have to start somewhere. If we just say we're not going to do this, then we're stuck. Just recognizing that people are individuals, really, and they experience change differently. The way they would like to communicate their fears would be different as well. And the way they work is sometimes different between them as well. So how is it going to affect people? And everyone's opinion is still, again, sounds cliche, but it is important. What then is done with that information is probably the next step. And of course, not everyone's fears, concerns, etc. can be resolved and addressed, but as long as we hear them and they felt heard, I think that would be a good step.
This is a topic that you can end up talking around for hours on end. But let me move on and ask you quite specifically about the acceptance that technology has a role to play in the future of law. We're still battling adoption. We've talked about that. Again, you're a technology business. What blockers are you seeing that is preventing the adoption of wider technology? And I guess the other question that people are concerned about is whether technology actually is going to replace people and expertise.
I was going to go to your last question first, actually. I definitely don't think it should replace expertise. I think there is a very big difference. In our business in particular, I can't speak for others, we're actually trying to reduce some of the administration of this, which is a big part of conveyancing, so that in the best world, conveyancers can really do their very best and be the most expert they can in their role without however much percentage of their time taken up with administration. So no, from my point of view, I definitely don't want it to replace the expertise or wanting to be a conveyancer or being a conveyancer, but could we take away all of the other stuff or help make better the other stuff? Is there anything that's currently taking a lot of your time as a conveyancer that's not really conveyancing? You're not doing your role, you're taking time doing administration. Sounds just like a nothing task, but it's not, is it? It's massive. It's emails, it's your responding to your clients, which is sometimes part of conveyancing, but sometimes just letting them know that it's going to be so long before you hear from me again. If we could use technology to help with that, I think that would be a big help and move things forward and potentially take down this pressure and this workload.
I think the consensus is that we don't want technology to replace expertise. Clearly, there are efficiencies that we can make as organizations using technology, and that might lead to some of those admin tasks being diminished or done away with. But we want that, don't we? I don't want to be messing around with admin rubbish when actually I could be doing or using that time to do something that's so much more productive, dealing better with client care, creating greater transparency for clients around the transaction timescales and what's going on. All those things that we are crying out for as a profession, but we're just not able to deliver just yet.
I know we talked about barriers to adoption. This is very similar. I do want technology to help in my administration. Do I want lots of different technologies clashing with each other to help with my administration? No, that is tricky. Conveyancers maybe use an average of, I'm not sure how they can use 3.7, but yes, 3.7 different tools to help with their transaction. That makes it very difficult as well. So I have a process, I have a tool as a conveyancer that could help me reduce this administration, but then I have another one that's going to help me with something else. And that needs to be really seamless to really help my workload and drive down some of the things that aren't about conveyancing. I think that is important. And that is always difficult because there are lots of different things at play, but they have to be able to work with one another and make it easy. I don't want duplication of effort. That makes my life as a conveyancer a lot harder. I don't want to have to fumble around and work out how I'm going to get to one thing that then doesn't talk to another thing. So that's really difficult, and that's not what we're trying to get to as well. We talked at the front of this podcast, David, about what I do now at Collaborative. We specifically deal with inquiries. We just do inquiries, and trying to make that very admin heavy part of conveyancing a little bit lighter for conveyancers if we can, and still enable them to do their role. We would love to reduce some of that administration and the back and forth that is always very, very different. Each law firm operates differently. There are lots of different ways that people interact with each other, from letters to paper to PDFs to sending emails. We want to make it as secure as possible. We want to make it as easy as possible so that the conveyancer can really concentrate on what they need to do, which is the handling of the inquiries. We want to ensure that things aren't missed. That could happen. By all best intentions, that could happen somewhere along the line, and that makes it very difficult for everybody involved. And we want to ensure that conveyancers have this real idea of actually what they do have on their workload and their cases and their inquiries on top of that. And we're trying to make that easier for them in a way that we can, which I admit is a technology-based solution, and make that speak to as many other technologies as possible if we can do that, so that they have this kind of seamless way of working if possible in the future.
Going back to the top of the conversation, we started with this idea that process is good and bad. It brings a lot of conformity, it brings a lot of standardization, but it also has a risk of stifling flair and even innovation at times as well. So we've got to make sure that we've got the right balance between process and innovation in a business. We are out of time. I said that we could probably talk about this for the rest of the day. Almost certainly, it's a topic that a lot of people have got a lot of thoughts on, so people are very welcome to comment on the podcast and to come back to us with any thoughts. But I really appreciate you joining and for sharing your insight, Gemma. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to Gemma. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.